So I want you to picture human history as a ladder.
Okay, a ladder. I can see that.
Right. You start down in the dirt with the ancients,
Hmm.
and then you take a step up to the medieval era.
Making some progress.
Exactly. And finally, you climb up to this bright, shining rung of the modern world. It is incredibly comforting to think that way.
It really is. It gives us a sense of direction.
Right. We look back down that ladder and we think, look how far we've come. And we just assume we're going to keep building new rungs, right?
Just climbing upward towards some ultimate utopian peak of human achievement.
Exactly. But today, we are taking an absolute sledgehammer to that ladder.
We really are. It is a complete demolition of the way most of us were taught to view time.
Yeah, we're replacing that neat architectural linear progression with something much more chaotic and, frankly, much more biological.
Biological is the perfect word for it. We are going to explore this idea that history isn't a ladder at all. It is a garden.
A garden. I love that analogy. And in this garden, civilizations aren't just, data points on a graph of progress. They are living, breathing organisms.
They're plants.
They are plants. They are born as seeds. They shoot up into the soil. They bloom brilliantly. And then by the unbreakable laws of nature, they rot and they die.
Which is a heavy thought.
It's massive. And then we are diving into the source material of two monumental historical thinkers who really champion this view, Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee.
And I think it is crucial to state right at the beginning here that our mission in this deep dive is to act as neutral guides.
Absolutely. Neutral guides through this garden.
Because, especially with Oswald Spengler, we are analyzing a framework built by someone with some incredibly bleak perspectives on societal decline.
Oh, very bleak.
Yeah. He believed dictatorial regimes, what he termed Caesarism, were an inevitable and even natural end state of a dying culture.
Right, which is a lot to unpack.
It is. So our goal is to dissect the architecture of these paradigm-shifting ideas. We're not endorsing the political baggage. We want to understand the mechanics of how these two thinkers arrived at such a radical departure from the norm.
Yeah, we are popping the hood and looking at the engine of the philosophy. And, you listening right now might be asking yourself, why should you care about the historical theories of two guys from the early 20th century?
It's a fair question.
It is. But you should care because the way we categorize the past directly dictates how we predict the future.
Exactly. The lens through which you view history completely alters how you read the morning headlines.
Yes, how you interpret shifts in global power.
Or how you process that nagging anxiety of, where is all of this actually going?
Right, that feeling we all get. If you swap the lens from a ladder of progress to a garden of blooming and dying flowers, the entire world just looks different.
It forces you to look at the chaos in the world today and ask, is this just a temporary roadblock on our upward climb? Or is this the natural, predictable shedding of autumn leaves from a tree that has simply reached the end of its life cycle?
Oof. Yeah. That is the question. So to understand how a thinker could confidently arrive at that kind of terminal diagnosis, we need to start with the architect of this decline theory.
Oswald Spengler.
Oswald Spengler. So let's unpack this guy. He was born in Blankenburg, Germany in 1880. And the first thing from the text that really stands out to me about his background is that he wasn't a classically trained historian.
No, not at all. He went to universities in Munich, Berlin, and Halle. But his focus was mathematics and natural science.
He was a numbers guy.
He was. He actually worked as a schoolmaster teaching math and science until about 1911.
And 1911 is a really fascinating pivot point for him.
It is. That is when the core concepts for his massive magnum opus, The Decline of the West, really began to crystallize for him.
Right, and he was so consumed by this vision that he just gave up teaching entirely to build out this philosophy.
Yeah, he had the first draft essentially finished by 1914.
Yeah.
Right as the shadow of the First World War was falling over Europe.
The timing is wild.
It is. The volumes were eventually published in 1918 and 1922. So they're dropping right into a post-war society that was profoundly traumatized.
Right, a society that was suddenly very open to the idea that Western civilization might not actually be invincible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the paradox of Spengler is what makes his work so wild to read today.
Oh, the paradox is huge. Because here is a man formally trained in the rigorous empirical natural sciences.
Right.
Yet his historical worldview heavily favors instinct over understanding.
Yes. He values the organic life of the soil over the intellectual life of the city.
He champions intuitive, almost mystical insight over the actual scientific method.
It's a complete 180. He writes with this lofty Olympian detachment, looking down at centuries of human striving. But beneath that detachment is this fiercely anti-rational fanaticism.
I look at that paradox, the mathematician who abandons logic to embrace mysticism, and it feels like a master watchmaker suddenly deciding that watches aren't mechanical.
Right, like they're powered by magic.
Exactly. If you are trained in cause and effect, in physics and formulas, how do you pivot so violently to become anti-rationalist when you look at human societies?
I think it's a profound realization of the limits of a given tool. Spengler looked at the staggering complexity of human history and realized that people are not predictable variables in an equation.
That makes sense.
You can calculate the exact trajectory of a cannonball using physics. You cannot calculate the rise of a new religion or the sudden collapse of an empire using those same rigid laws.
Because humans are messy.
Extremely messy. He believed that applying the scientific method to human history doesn't just fail. It actively kills the subject.
Wow.
Yeah, he thought it takes a living, breathing story and turns it into a dead specimen on a dissection table.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if you throw out the scientific method, you're just left in the dark, right? You can't just guess how history works.
Right.
So Spengler must have had an alternative metric for measuring a society, a different framework to replace the latter he just burned down.
He did, and it's what he called his morphological view of the world.
Morphological.
Yeah. Morphology is a term usually reserved for biology. It's the study of the forms and structures of living organisms.
So he's really leaning into the garden metaphor.
Completely. Spengler treats that standard linear progression of history, ancient to medieval to modern, as just an absurd arrogance.
He literally views it with contempt.
He does. He argues that history is simply the continual emergence, blooming, and dissolution of completely distinct, isolated cultures.
And he means biological quite literally here. These cultures aren't just metaphors for plants.
No, he argues they operate on the exact same organic laws. They have a distinct lifespan.
Right. He pegs the life cycle of a culture at approximately 1,000 years.
Which is such a specific number.
Yeah.
He surveys the vast span of human existence and identifies 8 primary, distinct cultures that have emerged.
Okay, let's list those. There's the Egyptian, the Chinese, the ancient Semitic, the Indian, the Magian.
The Apollinian, which
Yeah.
is his term for the Greco-Roman classical world.
Okay.
And the Faustian, which is his term for Western culture spanning roughly the last millennium.
To really understand his model, we have to unpack those terms because they are incredibly specific.
They are.
Take the Apollinian culture of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Spengler argues that the soul of this culture was entirely focused on the immediate present.
The immediate present and the physical, tangible body.
Right. Think of a Greek statue. Perfect, finite, existing entirely in the physical space it occupies.
Yes. Now, contrast that with the Faustian culture, his term for the West.
Right.
The Faustian soul is characterized by a relentless striving into the infinite.
Just constantly pushing.
Exactly. It is never satisfied with the present or the tangible. It is always looking past the horizon, constantly pushing boundaries.
Whether that is exploring new continents, peering into microscopes, or building cathedral spires that reach infinitely into the sky.
Exactly. That's the Faustian drive.
And every single one of these distinct cultures, whether it is Apollinian or Faustian, goes through the exact same biological phases.
Yes. They pass from a period of growth into a phase of civilization.
Now, here is where we have to completely recalibrate our modern vocabulary. Because normally if someone says a society has achieved civilization, we think that's a triumph, right?
Yes.
We think it means they have running water, codified laws, massive infrastructure.
But for Spengler, civilization is a death sentence.
A death sentence.
Yeah. It is the final, rigid phase of a culture's life. He says culture represents the dynamic, creative spring and summer.
That is when a society's art is vital, its religion is deeply felt.
Its philosophy is groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Yes. But civilization is the frozen winter.
The win.
It is the moment a society stops creating and starts merely managing. It becomes bureaucratic, mechanical, and obsessed with practical expansion rather than spiritual depth.
So he looks at the classical Apollinian culture and compares it to the Western Faustian culture. And his diagnosis for us is incredibly stark.
Very stark. He argues that the creative phase, the spring and summer of the West, is completely over.
We are in the winter.
We have entered the winter. We are in the civilization phase. We might be building massive global supply chains and huge cities, but spiritually and creatively, the history of West European mankind is closing.
Wow. And the text points out he uses a fascinating, if slightly gross, analogy to describe how traditional historians view this.
Oh, the tapeworm analogy.
Yes. He says professional historians look at history like a tapeworm. They see humanity just industriously adding one epoch to another, growing longer and longer, segment by segment, forever.
But Spengler sees history as a field of flowers growing with superb aimlessness.
Superb aimlessness, that phrase is just devastating.
It really is. It completely strips away any grand narrative of human destiny.
Because it implies there is no ultimate goal. The oak tree doesn't grow to achieve some philosophical perfection.
Right. It grows because it is an oak tree, and then it dies. Spengler insists that mankind as a unified, progressing entity doesn't actually exist.
He even quotes Goethe on this, right?
He does. He quotes Goethe stating that mankind is merely an abstraction, a zoological expression.
Just an empty word.
Yeah. You can't write a history of humanity any more than you can write a unified history of a field of wild orchids. You can only chronicle the specific birth, life, and death of this orchid here and then that orchid over there.
I mean, think about how liberating, yet terrifying, that is for you listening. What if mankind isn't building toward anything but just blooming and dying in isolated patches?
It's a total paradigm shift.
But the audacity of that claim is wild. To look at all of human achievement and say, none of this is connected, and we are currently in the dying phase of our specific plant. How can he be so confident in this massive overarching rule?
Well, that brings us to the underlying machinery of his thought, his epistemology.
Right. How does Spengler believe we actually acquire knowledge about the world in the first place? Because, as we mentioned, he claims the laws of physics simply do not apply to human events.
This is where we see the mathematician actively dismantling mathematical supremacy. Spengler makes a foundational epistemological claim. He says there is no such thing as absolute eternal truth.
None.
None. Truth is inextricably tied to a specific cultural standpoint. What is profoundly true for an ancient Egyptian might be completely incomprehensible to a modern European, and vice versa.
Which, again, is a massive concession from a math guy. We are taught that 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of whether you are building a pyramid in ancient Egypt or a skyscraper in Manhattan.
Exactly. But Spengler navigates this by drawing a hard, impenetrable boundary between two ways of perceiving reality. The world is nature, and the world is history.
Okay, let's break those down.
Sure. Natural science operates in the world as nature. It deals with causal uniformity, physics, measurability. It deals with what he calls the become.
Things that are already finished.
Finished, fixed, mechanical, and essentially dead. The language of the world as nature is mathematical number.
And the world as history is the complete opposite.
Complete opposite. It comprehends the becoming.
Right, so it is about constant flux, organic development, and life.
Yes, you cannot capture becoming with a quantitative formula. If you try to analyze a living culture by breaking it down into a mechanical system of causes and effects, like saying, this specific economic policy caused this specific war, Spengler argues you are just doing natural science in disguise.
You are treating history like a dead machine.
Exactly. The language of history isn't mathematical number. It is chronological number. It is the intuitive rhythm of time.
So, if the scientific method is useless for understanding history, what on earth is the alternative?
Spengler argues the only valid method for studying history is physiognomic.
Physiognomic, like reading a face.
Exactly like reading a face. Instead of dissecting the organs to see how the blood pumps, you look at the expressions on the face to understand the character and the soul of the person.
So he believed that the true nature of a historical culture can only be grasped by perceptive genius and intuition. It requires the eye of an artist.
Right. A mechanical historian looks at a society and catalogs its GDP, its troop numbers, its crop yields. A physiognomic historian looks at a society and perceives its underlying destiny.
It's not about what events happened. It's about what those events signify within the life cycle of that specific culture.
What's fascinating here is how he uses a painting analogy based on the text to explain this.
I love this analogy.
Yeah. If you ask a purely scientific systematist to paint a portrait, they will paint with mathematical fidelity. They will measure the exact distance between the eyes, paint every single eyelash.
It will look exactly like a photograph.
But it will be entirely lifeless. But if you ask Rembrandt to paint a portrait, he isn't primarily concerned with exact physical dimensions. He is painting the soul of the subject.
He captures a physiognomic truth that a tape measure could never find.
Precisely. Spengler argues that true history requires that Rembrandt-like artistic insight. You have to be born with a feel for the rhythm of history.
He draws heavily on Goethe's concept of living nature versus Isaac Newton's dead nature for this, right?
He does. And there's a brilliant historical anecdote involving Goethe that perfectly illustrates this physiognomic feeling.
Oh, at the Battle of Valmy.
Yes, the evening of the Battle of Valmy in 1792. It is a massive, chaotic turning point in the French Revolutionary Wars.
Right, and Goethe is actually there. He's sitting around a bivouac fire with a group of soldiers and officers, and amidst the smoke and the confusion, he turns to them and says, "Here and now begins a new epoch of world history, and you gentlemen can say that you were there."
Spengler holds that moment up as the absolute pinnacle of historical perception. Goethe was not analyzing supply lines. He wasn't calculating troop trajectories.
He just felt it.
He used his profound intellectual intuition to immediately sense the shifting destiny of the world. He felt the soul of the era transforming in real time.
I have to pause here, though, because there is a massive logical contradiction in Spengler's framework, and it's kind of the elephant in the room.
So here.
He builds this entire philosophy on the premise that there is no absolute truth. Everything is completely relative to your specific, isolated culture.
Right.
But then he turns around and lays down this ironclad universal biological rule. Every culture lives for 1,000 years, goes through growth and civilization, and then dies.
It's a glaring contradiction.
If truth is relative, how can his grand theory of morphology be absolutely true for everyone?
It is the great paradox of the decline of the West, and his contemporary critics absolutely hammered him for it.
I bet.
Yeah, Spengler actually had to address this in the preface to a revised edition of the book. His defense was essentially to lean even harder into his own relativity.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He stated that his morphological framework is not an eternal universal truth for all mankind. He said it is only true for him, dictated by his own blood and history.
Wait, what?
He admitted that a Chinese philosopher or an ancient Egyptian priest would never see history this way. His theory is specifically a Faustian truth, designed only for the Faustian mind living in the winter of the West.
Okay, that is the ultimate philosophical escape hatch. I am completely right, but my rightness only applies to people who share my cultural DNA.
Pretty much.
Wow. But, if you accept his premise that a culture is driven by a single unified soul rather than a series of random mechanical events, it leads to arguably the most mind-bending part of his entire theory.
Morphological relationship.
Yes. Because if a culture has one soul, then you should be able to see that soul reflected in literally everything that culture produces.
And this is where Spengler's genius for synthesizing vastly different fields really shines. He insists that all visible history, every war, every building, every scientific discovery is simply the outward expression, the sign and embodiment of a culture's internal soul.
Right.
Therefore, there's a deep morphological relationship that binds together all branches of a culture. You cannot separate a society's mathematics from its politics or its art from its craftsmanship.
Because they're all just different dialects of the exact same underlying language.
Precisely. He argues that it is absurd to speak of mathematics as if it is a single, universal discipline that has just been slowly improving over time.
Which is how we usually think of it.
Right, but he says there is no single mathematics. There's an Apollinian mathematics, a Magian mathematics, a Faustian mathematics, and they are deeply different in their essence because they're attempting to solve completely different spiritual problems.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because when you just list the connections he makes, it sounds like absolute word salad at first.
It does.
He argues there is a direct, undeniable uniformity between the invention of the differential calculus, the dynastic political principles of King Louis XIV,
Yep.
the development of the space perspective in Western oil painting, the invention of railroads and long-range weapons, and the modern system of credit economics.
At first glance, that list makes no sense whatsoever. What does calculus have to do with credit cards and absolute monarchy?
Exactly.
But if we apply Spengler's concept of the Faustian soul, the connections become incredibly clear.
Okay, let's walk through it. So the Faustian soul, the Western soul, is defined by an obsession with infinite space, limitless reach, and constant unending striving.
Yes.
So we look at Western mathematics, we invent calculus. Calculus is literally the mathematics of continuous chain.
It is the study of limits approaching infinity.
Right. It is a mathematical language built entirely to grapple with the infinite.
Now look at Western politics during its prime expansive phase. Louis XIV represents the absolute monarch. The political goal is no longer just managing a local city-state, as the Greeks did.
Right, the Greeks were very localized.
Exactly. The Faustian goal is Limitless, centralized control over vast, expansive territories.
Uh,
It is the projection of political power toward an infinite limit.
okay, then we move to art. Look at classical Greek art. It is often flat, or it focuses entirely on the finite, perfect human body in the immediate present.
Right.
But what does Western fashion art do? It invents the vanishing point. It develops deep space perspective in oil painting. The eye of the viewer is intentionally drawn away from the foreground, out into infinite space on the canvas.
The art is literally striving toward the horizon.
Yes.
And how does this soul manifest in the physical, practical world? We invent the railroad, the telephone, and long-range artillery.
And what are these technologies doing? They are tools designed specifically to conquer distance.
They are built to shrink infinite space, to annihilate physical boundaries, and to project our will as far across the globe as possible.
And finally, the economy. Spengler points to credit economics, contrapuntal music, and credit economics.
Right. Think about fractional reserve banking or a 30-year mortgage.
Yes, this is an economic system that is no longer based on the physical, finite gold coin you hold in your hand right now.
It is a highly abstract mathematical system based entirely on infinite future growth.
We are spending money today that will supposedly exist in the infinite tomorrow.
Spengler is arguing that none of these developments are isolated coincidences. Calculus, the vanishing point, the railroad, and the credit economy are all the exact same psychological drive. The Faustian destiny, just wearing different hats.
I mean, it is a stunningly holistic way to view human achievement. It's like looking at a tree. If a purely mechanical historian looks at a giant oak tree, they might study the bark, the leaves, and the roots in isolation.
They might categorize them as completely different phenomena because they look and function differently.
Exactly. But Spengler, the physiognomic historian, looks at the bark, the leaves, and the roots and says they all share the exact same DNA. They are all expressions of the exact same organism.
It makes you wonder about today.
Oh, absolutely. I want you, listening right now, to test this theory on the world we live in right now. What is the shared soul between our current outputs?
Look at the decentralized, borderless architecture of the internet.
Look at the highly abstract, speculative nature of global cryptocurrency.
Look at the repetitive, algorithmic structure of modern pop music and social media feeds.
Spengler would say it is not a coincidence that these things emerged at the exact same time. They are identical expressions of the underlying urge driving our current cultural phase.
And the implication of this morphological unity is profound and highly critical of modern Western thought.
Extremely critical.
If every culture has its own completely unique soul, its own completely unique mathematics, its own concept of space and time, then it is an act of supreme intellectual imperialism for one culture to assume that its specific way of thinking is universally applicable to the whole globe.
Or to all of human history.
Ex-
Which leads perfectly into Spengler's aggressive attack on Western ego. Because if our math and our art are uniquely ours, then forcing them onto the rest of the timeline is absurd. He sets out to completely smash what he calls the Ptolemaic system of history.
It's a very apt astronomical metaphor.
Yeah. The Ptolemaic system was the ancient geocentric belief that the Earth was the steady, fixed center of the universe, and that the sun, the moon, and all the planets revolved around us.
And Spengler argues that the traditional Western view of history is exactly like that. We treat the ground of West Europe as the steady pole, the natural center of the historical universe.
We look at these massive millennial cultures, China, India, Babylon, Egypt, the Maya, and we treat them like minor moons orbiting around our brilliant Western sun.
We only judge their historical events based on how they intersect with or relate to us.
Yes. So he proposes what he calls a Copernican discovery in the historical sphere.
Right, because Copernicus proved that the Earth is not the center, but merely one of many planets orbiting the sun.
Exactly. Spengler argues that classical and Western cultures have no privileged position whatsoever against India, Babylon, China, Egypt. They are not the main characters of history.
They all count for just as much mass and spiritual greatness.
And he specifically tears into the Western delusion of modern times. He says that ever since the Crusades, the West has just kept stretching and stretching the word modern like a rubber band to accommodate whatever era we happen to be living in.
We imply that we are the definitive third kingdom, the ultimate culmination of everything that came before.
We act as if all of human history was just a lengthy prologue to finally get to us.
To dismantle this, he takes a swing at some of the most revered Western philosophers. Take Immanuel Kant, for example.
Oh, this is a great example.
Kant writes extensively about universal ethical ideas. He believes he is uncovering the fundamental moral rules for man as an abstract global concept.
But Spengler reads Kant and says, no, Kant is simply articulating the necessary forms of Western thought.
Right? An ancient Greek philosopher like Aristotle possessed a fundamentally different intellectual and moral structure. Kant's categories of thought are completely alien to a Russian mind or a Chinese or Arab mind.
It's just a fallacy of arguing from particular to particular. And Spengler actually uses some incredibly specific, almost humorous examples from literature to ground this high philosophy.
He looks at Henrik Ibsen, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
the famous 19th century playwright who wrote A Doll's House. So the play is about Nora, a woman feeling trapped by marriage and societal expectations. And Western critics point to this play and say, this captures the universal human condition. It speaks to the universal woman problem.
And Spengler essentially laughs at that interpretation.
He does.
He points out that Nora's problems are the highly specific, hyperlocal anxieties of a Northwest European city dweller, with a Protestant upbringing, living in an apartment that costs 100 to 300 pounds a year in rent.
Yes. Her context is so hyper-specific to the Faustian winter phase. Spengler says it is comic to try and apply Nora's middle-class 19th century spiritual premises to a Turkish peasant or Caesar's wife in ancient Rome.
You are taking your highly specific local weather and mistaking it for the global climate.
I love that. And he does the exact same thing with Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, the Superman.
Right. Nietzsche writes about the Superman and the Dionysian, and the West heralds this as a profound universal truth about human ambition.
But Spengler asks, what does the concept of the Superman mean to an Islamic scholar living in a completely different spiritual paradigm? Or to a highly civilized Chinese thinker?
It means absolutely nothing.
It doesn't translate not just linguistically, but spiritually. What does Tolstoy do with Dante or Luther? Nothing. The psychological frameworks are totally alien to one another.
Think about how guilty we are of this exact fallacy today. I mean, how often do you assume that our current fiery debates about property rights, about marriage, about the role of science, about what constitutes a tragedy, are universal, eternal human debates?
Spengler would look at our discourse and say, you are trapped in a bubble. These are just the temporary anxieties of your specific isolated cultural plan.
You think you are debating the nature of humanity, but you are just debating the nature of the 21st century West.
For Spengler, universal validity is a complete fallacy. The real student of history, he argues, must treat no single standpoint as absolutely right or absolutely wrong.
Right. You have to gather a group of historically limited solutions and measure them by utterly impersonal morphological criteria. You must accept that for other men, there are profoundly different truths.
Spengler's vision is vast, it is poetic, and ultimately it is deeply pessimistic about the future of the West. He is the brilliant, brooding artist throwing dark paint onto a massive canvas.
He really is. But he wasn't the only thinker trying to find a grand, overarching pattern to human civilization in the shadow of the world wars.
No, he wasn't.
While Spengler was relying on mysticism and intuition in Germany, across the English Channel, another historian was attempting to build a massive framework of his own, but using completely different tools.
And that brings us to Arnold Joseph Toynbee, who serves as the perfect, inductive counterweight to Spengler's intuitive leaps.
Let's talk about Toynbee. He was born in 1889, just a decade after Spengler, but his environment couldn't have been more different.
He was deeply embedded in the British establishment, educated at Balliol College, Oxford.
Right. And during the First World War, while Spengler was isolating himself in his study writing Decline of the West, Toynbee was working as a diplomat.
Yes, in the Middle Eastern section of the British delegation to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference.
The contrast in their daily lives is just striking, and it perfectly explains the difference in their philosophies. Spengler is the solitary schoolmaster who retreats inward, relying on sudden flashes of intuition.
And Toynbee is a diplomat. He's a professor of Byzantine and modern Greek at London University and the director of studies at the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
He is a man surrounded by archives, delegations, data, and systemic bureaucracy.
And that bureaucratic, highly educated background deeply informs his historical methodology. Toynbee's life's work is a massive undertaking called A Study of History.
Which is huge, right?
Massive. 10 dense volumes published between 1934 and 1954. If Spengler's approach is physiognomic and poetic, Toynbee attempts an inductive method.
Inductive, so building up from the fact.
Exactly. His work is built on systematic learning, massive historical erudition, and a rigorous comparative examination of vast amounts of data.
But they both agree on the foundational premise. The latter is a lie.
Yes.
History is not a single straight line of progress. They both look at the past and see recurring biological patterns. But because Toynbee is actually looking at the data rather than relying on pure intuition, his map looks very different.
Very different. Where Spengler looked at the whole world and saw just 8 massive, isolated cultures, Toynbee zooms in with a much finer lens. He identifies 21 distinct civilizations.
21, that's a lot more specific.
Yeah. He identifies groups like the Hellenic, the Syriac, the Cynic, the Minoan, the Andean, and many others.
And while he doesn't tie their existence to a strict, mystical, 1,000-year biological clock like Spengler does, he absolutely sees a recurring structural life cycle.
He does. Toynbee argues that these 21 civilizations all go through stages of genesis, growth, breakdown, and eventually dissolution.
But Toynbee is much more interested in the how and the why of these transitions. How does a civilization grow? He introduces a concept called challenge and response.
Challenge and response.
Yeah. A society is confronted by a massive challenge. Maybe it's a harsh physical environment or sudden external invasion. If the society's creative minority can organize a successful response to that challenge, the civilization grows.
But if they fail to respond creatively, the civilization enters a phase of breakdown.
And this leads to one of the most fascinating features of Toynbee's theory, particularly his analysis of the final phase of dissolution.
Right, because when a civilization has suffered a breakdown and has exhausted its creative energy, it enters what he calls a time of troubles.
A time of troubles, that sounds ominous.
It is. It is a period of chaotic, fratricidal warfare and internal decay. But the civilization doesn't just immediately disappear.
Right, it has this sort of massive structural death rattle. Toynbee notes that to end the chaos of the time of troubles, the dying civilization will almost always form a universal state.
He uses the Hellenic civilization as the prime example here.
Right. The Greeks had their brilliant creative phase, then they entered a chaotic time of troubles with the Peloponnesian Wars. And how did it end? It was succeeded by a unitary, massive political structure, the Roman Empire.
It is a brilliant parallel to Spengler's concept of Caesarism in the winter phase of a culture. Both of these thinkers look at massive, expansive, highly organized empires like the Roman Empire or the Han Dynasty in China, not as the ultimate peak of human achievement, but as a rigid bureaucratic shell that forms over a society that has already lost its creative soul.
The empire brings peace and order, but it is the peace of the graveyard.
So what does this all mean? It makes me think of an astronomical analogy.
Let's hear it.
A civilization in Toynbee's universal state phase is like a dying star that expands into a massive red giant.
Yeah, that's good.
If you just look at it from the outside, it looks bigger, brighter, and more powerful than it ever has been. It dominates the sky. But structurally, it has run out of its core fuel.
Right.
The expansion is actually the final phase of its life cycle, right before it collapses into a white dwarf. The Roman Empire was a red giant.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The empire is managing expansion, not generating new cultural heat. But, if Spengler is the artist painting this dynamic, Toynbee is the meticulous architect trying to prove it with blueprints.
He is gathering endless historical data from his 21 civilizations to prove inductively that this red giant phase is a universal law of breakdown.
But relying on induction to prove a grand historical theory comes with its own massive pitfalls. The source material explicitly notes that Toynbee's method has been the subject of very severe criticism from other historians.
It has.
And it raises an incredible question about how we process information. Can you ever truly be purely inductive when evaluating 21 different, staggeringly complex civilizations?
It is the ultimate problem of confirmation bias on a macro-historical scale. If you start with a grand overarching theory that all civilizations must go through a breakdown and inevitably end in a universal state, and then you go digging through the massive chaotic histories of the Incas, the Chinese, the Egyptians, and the Greeks, aren't you inevitably going to cherry-pick the facts that fit your blueprint?
Exactly. History is so incredibly vast and messy. If you push hard enough, you can force almost any historical event into a neat little categorical box.
If a war fits your theory of a time of troubles, you highlight it. If a period of peace contradicts your theory of breakdown, you explain it away as a minor anomaly.
You end up creating a false sense of scientific certainty about chaotic human events.
That is the eternal tension in the philosophy of history, beautifully illustrated by these two men. Spengler is criticized for relying on mystical intuition and simply ignoring any historical facts that don't fit his dark, poetic narrative.
Right.
And Toynbee is criticized for organizing the facts so rigidly that he turns the organic messiness of human life into a forced artificial system.
It is wild to step back and look at the sheer scale of the journey we've just taken. We started this deep dive with the comforting, everyday assumption of a single linear timeline.
The ladder of progress that we are all supposedly climbing together.
And these two thinkers, using completely different tools, one using poetic intuition and the other using massive systemic data, have completely demolished that ladder. We have walked out of the classroom timeline and into a vivid biological garden of distinct, isolated, and ultimately mortal cultures.
And whether you find yourself leaning towards Spengler's tragic, artistic poetry or Toynbee's systemic, architectural blueprints, the ultimate lesson we have to take from both of them is a profound lesson in historical humility.
Humility, yes.
To truly understand world history, you have to free yourself from the limitations of your own horizon. You have to drop the conceit that your specific culture, your specific political systems, and your specific practical interests are the center of the universe or the definitive end of the story.
And that leaves us with a massive, haunting question to mull over as we look at the world today. We've talked about how liberating and how terrifying this garden metaphor truly is.
But a lot to process.
Let's play the game for a second. Let's assume Spengler is right. Let's assume cultures really are like plants that bloom, go to seed in a rigid, bureaucratic civilization phase, and inevitably die.
Okay.
And let's say he is right that our Western Faustian culture is currently deep in its winter phase, expanding as a red giant but out of creative fuel.
If we accept that premise.
When we look at the news today, we are always eagerly looking for the next stage of our culture. We look for the next technological leap in AI or the next evolution of our democratic political systems. But if Spengler is right, the future doesn't belong to a continuation of our ideas at all. Our plant is dying.
So what comes next?
What if, somewhere on the planet right now, a completely new culture is in its infancy? A seed just breaking the soil. A culture with a fundamentally different mathematics that we couldn't even compute. A totally alien concept of space and time.
A soul that we literally do not have the intellectual hardware to understand or appreciate.
Exactly. Because we are so trapped in our Faustian minds, we wouldn't recognize their growth as progress. We might not even recognize it as human history. What would that seedling even look like?
It is a thought that completely shatters how you look at the future.
It really does. Thank you for joining us in the garden today and taking this deep dive.